Gukesh D, what to say? He's on 7 wins out of 7 at the Chess Olympiad. I mean, this is simply phenomenal from a 16-year-old. I've seen the most insane stats on Twitter today. So he's gained like 100 rating points in the last 5 months. He's now up to world 25, world number 25. He's almost number 2 in India. He's catching up Hari Krishna. He's like 5 rating points behind him. He just cannot stop winning. So this is the game he played today. It was the India B team or second team against Cuba. This was his game. He had black. He was playing Carlos Daniel Albornoz Cabrera. And, 25-78. These are no slouch players. Yesterday he was playing a nearly 2700 guy. He just cannot stop winning. Let's see what he does. So he had a Sicilian defence on the board here. E4, pawn to C5, knight F3, knight C6, and now white goes back into a C3 Sicilian here, looking to play that D4, set up the big pawn centre, and Gukesh goes D5. A very thematic way to play, because after you bring the queen out early, because the pawn sits here, you can't jump a knight, pick up a tempo. So now D4 was played, knight to F6, and you might be wondering, well, with the queen sat there, what happens if white tries to just take over the centre here? But then you can check here, and however white blocks, bishop, queen, whatever, you can then take on d4 with a good game. So instead here we had takes on c5, an unusual move by the way. The most common is just bishop to e2 developing, and then again black can carry on taking here or e6. But we had takes on c5, allowing black to take the queens off, but then after pawn e6, preparing to recapture here, this is where white goes pawn to b4, tries to hold on to that extra pawn. So this is the idea of the variation. So pawn a5 played, the natural undermining move. And now I was clicking around here to see if white can hold on to the pawn. Now you clearly can't do this one, then we have the captures, standard trick here, then you lose your rook. So none of this is any good. But what happens if you try, where are we here, bishop to d2? Well, then the problem is you can plant this knight on e4, hit the bishop. If it drops to e1, then there's bishop e7 coming to f6 down here, and you just can't stop these threats. Say knight c3, bishop f6, and if you go say rook c1, well, you can trade everything off here, then the rook takes on a2. And actually here, the computer wants to sack an exchange already, take on e4, give the rook. So you just can't hold on to this pawn, basically. So in this position here, after pawn a5, white kicks on with b5, the knight drops back to e7, and now I'm highlighting a couple of the top engine moves here, and they make complete sense. Break opening principles at your peril. So opening principles tell us develop your pieces, and that's what white should do here. Instead, they go knight to e5. Now, the whole idea is that black wants to clear this knight out of the way, and if you bring it to g6, which we saw in the game, well, now white can chop, black recaptures, you've picked up a tempo there, and you've got time to defend this pawn. But actually, this is just bad for white, because you've activated this rook instantly, and you can't actually hold on to this pawn here, because now knight g4 comes, hitting that defender. So there's no way to protect this pawn. It therefore advanced to c6. We now had a captures there, pawn recaptures, knight takes on e3, pawn takes, and now bishop a6, very simple move. Black says, okay, after you develop, I'm happy to actually trade, give my bishop pair, because now I'm activating my rook. I'm soon going to recoup this pawn, and look at your pawn structure. We'll play a few more moves here. So knight g3, rook here, keeping an eye on this one. It was defended. And now bishop d6 covered this checking square, so that after rook to b1, rook a6, king c2, rook takes on c6. Now you've recaptured that pawn. There's no checks. And this is the moment I want to pause. I mentioned pawn structure just a moment ago. So if we look at the trumps in the position for black, you've got the better pawn structure, all of these weaknesses to attack, of course. You've got the more active rooks, more space for them to swing. You've got the better minor piece here, this nice bishop raking in 2 directions. The knight's a little bit dominated, and you've got the safer king here if we compare the 2 kings. So this all adds up for a very decent and healthy advantage. So pawn e4 was now played. Good move, gives that rook some breathing room, then it can swing to here and defend. Now we had rook c7, covers this square. Now rook e3, king to e7, that's why the rook nudged back, it stops any rook b7 check when you bring the king up. Now rook d3 hit that bishop a bit, black ignored it, brought the rook here, pressures on this pawn, knight e2 added some defence, and now bishop e5. Look at that absolute monster just sat in the middle of the board, can't be kicked by any pawns. Pawn g3 was now played, rook c4, just one of those lovely positions for black where you can just sit on it, slowly micro improve, look for a chink in the armour. Rook to e3 played, and this rook actually doesn't have a ton of squares here, it's a bit unfortunately placed. So the bishop nudged back, comes here in some lines, and now if you try e5 by the way, well then we can go bishop c5, after the rook moves, rook e4, this pawn's now looking weak. So this is the problem, if you kick on with e5, try and gain some space, well that pawn could actually become weak later on. So white just waits, king to d3, now rook a4, probing here. And now if you defend like this, well then bishop c5 can come. After the rook moves away, well then we pick up this pawn after check, king moves, rook takes here. By the way, if on the check here you protect with the knight, well then of course there's this e5 move. That's the problem with ever putting the knight on d4. So this is why you can't protect this a pawn with the rook. That's why the knight hopped back to c1, and now black can get that kingside squeeze going using those pawns. Rook to b5 played, hits that g5 pawn. Pawn f6 defends, also covers the g5 square in future. King c2, bishop e5, king b3, and now rook a to c4, just nudging back, keeping the pressure. And if you try and take this one, well then of course we're taking here with check, and you're even losing a minor piece. So the knight hopped back to defend, now this pawn checked, the king moved away. Pawn g4, just lovely squeezing play like an anaconda just suffocating its victim. Rook b6, trying to activate, but it's all pretty desperate. White can only shuffle. Pawn g5 covers the f4 square. Rook a6 played, comes behind the pawn, and now bishop d6 nudges back, prepares to go pawn a3, and once it hits this square, then moving the rook to the b file using that kind of hook there is a very thematic idea. So king d3, pawn a3 supported by the bishop, and this is where white now goes for a counterplay shot. So they go pawn to e4, you know, who wants to sit there and suffer? Let's try and clear this e4 square, maybe we'll land a knight there one day. And the whole idea is that if the bishop captures, which is playable, well then it's left the protection of this pawn. You can take here. Okay, who knows if white can get this one going with counterplay. So instead Gukesh took with the pawn here. Now white went rook to a5. King f6 improved the king. Rook b5. And now king f5 prepares to maybe push e4 at the right moment if there's no pin. But this one's now chopped off immediately, so knight d4 check forces the king back because you can't capture due to that same pin. So it drops back here, knight back to e2. And now I wonder if this move was played to just entice white into shuffling the knight once again. You'd love to go e4 check here as black, but at the moment this knight holds the c3 pawn. I'll show the significance of that in a moment. Because after rook a4, a kind of waiting move, now this knight came to c1 and bang, e4 check. Because now if the rook takes, which the computer does actually want as its top move, well you can take here, king recaptures, and because that knight's no longer on e2, well now you can take on c3 here. Now the reason this is the top engine line is because it wants knight e2, allowing rook c2. I mean, this is why a human would never really play this concept. Giving this pawn and then going knight c3 as a defensive maneuver, and also looking to attack, generate some counterplay with knight e4 check. Still much better for black, don't get me wrong, but this was the top engine line here to try and generate some play. Excuse me, I've had a bit of a cold the last couple of days. So after e4 check, we didn't have takes with the rook. Instead, the king dropped back. Now rook a to c4, piling on the pressure on that c3 pawn. And the best move here was rook to b3. But then, you know, you can carry on torturing. Let's say bishop to b4, king d2 is technically best, just to show you one trick. I mean, say you went knight e2, looks very natural. Well, now this rook's getting embarrassed. Bishop c5, it's got no squares to actually go to. So these are just kind of the tactical problems in the position for white. So tough when you're defending. So rook b3 wasn't played. King b3 was, looks very natural, but this is a complete blunder. Can you spot the winning tactical move, which of course Gukesh found in this position here? So the shot to play here is bishop to f4. Just beautiful, beautiful deflection of this rook, because if it moves away to protect this knight, well, then we're crashing through on c3 with check. The king can't even step back to b2 because of that pawn. You know, you're picking up a whole minor piece. So here we had g takes on f4, and it was actually the final move. Then there was a resignation because the pawn would be recapturing. Look at that for a triple pawn attack. The rook has to give ground, and by the way, it can't even stay on any of these squares due to the pawns, so it would have to give ground, and now you take with check, and once again you're losing a minor piece here. This endgame's completely won. One of these is going to become a queen. So Gukesh is on fire. Do hit that subscribe button if you never want to miss a future game as I follow his ascent right now, and if you want to see another amazing game by him, click here. Thanks for watching, see you soon.